Hi there, it's Marcus again. I want to talk to you in a moment about world history and context, which I've got set up on the other screen. And, just to sort of give you a sense of how to navigate the piece, because it's a sizable reading and it's a key reading for the course, and because I think it is actually a really splendid example of a great academic essay. If you ever aspire to write such a thing, this is a great model. But before I start, I want to, do my normal sort of segue into something a little bit less relevant, but also highly relevant. David Christian, in this article, it goes to a lot of effort to talk about complexity and energy, and then the way human collective learning has harnessed these things and managed these processes in order to create the kind of wonderful world that we live in today. The world with paintings behind me, the world with manicured gardens. Well, mine's definitely not manicured outside, but it probably looks about as much as manicured as I do. But also the world of increasing cultural movements, flexibilities, and so on. So I want to talk to you very briefly about something that I wrote about 20 odd years ago now, called the tea bag, because this amazing thing, this tea bag here, for instance, is, you won't find this in Coles or Woolies, will you? But look at it, it's an oolong tea, and you've got Chinese writing there, and it comes from China. Wow, it comes from China. It's in my hand. It's a certain tea, an oolong tea that's grown in the highlands, okay? And just to prove it, I'm drinking, and where's the tea bag thing here? See, I haven't even taken it out yet, just to show you, again, how uncouth I am. But I tell you what, it's an awesome tea. I really like oolong. So we have a tea bag like this. Now, tea used to be, until 40 years ago or so, always leaf tea, and I still drink a lot of leaf tea, mainly because I'm a nerd and I really like teas, and I like the stories that tea tell me. And yet there's something about the tea bag, because it's disposable, it's instant, it's kind of a metaphor for much of our approach to the world. Everything's disposable, including nature, the environment, human beings by and large, except, your immediate family. You don't want to dispose necessarily of your mum and dad, or, spouses or whatever, or kids, though you may think about it sometimes, but generally tongue-in-cheek, okay? But disposability, speed, flexibility, convenience, definitely convenience, are all part of what makes our world so-called modern. That is also at the very heart of the problems we face in our environment today. And yet I'm aware of all this, and I still use the tea bag. Why? Because I like tea. I like this tea particularly. And when I run out, unfortunately, I have to wait until I either go back to China, or there is two shops that I have discovered in Melbourne that actually stock that tea. So I have to go down to Melbourne to see my mum and dad and siblings and that sort of thing. So let's get into the reading now, because in a sense, this world history and context reading is all about that tea bag. All right, I want you to understand that, because tea is a natural process. It's grown naturally and so on. It's harvested. These teas are harvested not just industrially. There's still many teas, high quality teas, are harvested by hand and so on. So there's a huge human story to be told around any object in our lives. Okay, so everything has a history, a world history, as well as possibly a very local and intimate history. So, world history and context. I'm just going to press a magic button. Okay, and I'm going to jump to this one. So I want to talk to you about this article, and I want to give you a sense of its structure and its purpose. Okay, so here we have a very fine article, reading for week 1. Many of you may have already started to get into it. Today is Sunday, the day before week 1 starts. And, if you were doing the quiz, you would only have one more day to do the quiz type thing, because it kicks in and drops out on a Monday of each week. So here we go. World history is all about, or history is all about context. So so it's here. Now I've gone through and I've yellow highlighted bits here. So, aha, look at this. And I've done that to try and give you not necessarily all the important pegs in the article, but certainly some of the ones that stand out for me in terms of supplying us the narrative logic that Christian is seeking to provide us. So he says one of the virtues of world history is that it helps us to see all the more specialised historical scholarship in a global context. In other words, Australian history, Chinese history, the history of the tea bag, or whatever it might be. They have global contexts, according to Christian, and he goes to great lengths in this article to demonstrate that. So we scroll down a bit further, and I get down to the next page. Come on, we can get there. Bing. Okay. So this is all part of his little introduction. The introduction ends here, okay, where he starts talking about modern cosmologies. And he says, well, one of the main aims of world history, okay, is to see the history of humanity as a single coherent story. Now, I quoted this in the short lecture the other day, okay. It also supplies, in a sense of the historical trajectory, the direction in which our overall history over the last 10, 20, 30, 50, 100,000 years has been going. In other words, we've been heading slowly but surely and with greater speed in the last few centuries and decades towards higher levels of complexity. That has involved considerable trial and error and so on, which makes for the history that we seek to cover in a course like this. So that's the introduction. Christian gives us an introduction. There are a few statements here he makes. One of the things, actually I like this bit, it's not highlighted because you'd end up with yellow napalm everywhere if it was. It states that it is world history is as much concerned about the non-literate communities as with the literate. Now normally history focuses on text, it's textual. So Christian seeks to open up textuality to a wider range of texts. One of the texts that I find particularly interesting is DNA, for instance, but archaeology, geology, geography, anthropology, sociology, even psychology, all supply different forms of textual and disciplinary logics and skills, techniques for unpacking the history of humanity. So let's move on then. So the first aspect to note here is that, and I've written this in here, this is my own annotation here, that there is a logic to what David Christian is trying to present us with. And that logic is, how do I say it? That logic is spelt out and linked to two key ideas. The first idea is energy, and the second idea is complexity. And it's embedded in a kind of narrative problem that David Christian gives us. And it's this, the narrative problem is the creation story. We've had different creation stories. We have the Dreamtime creation stories of the Indigenous Australians. We have creation stories from the ancient Greeks and the Romans. We have creation stories from our own Christian tradition of the Bible. We have creation stories, of course, from all cultures. We all need, as human species, collectively, we need to know, why is this so? Where have we come from? And so on. So we seek to explain this stuff through creation stories. Now, David Christian says quite clearly here, okay, in our modern context, evolution of modern cosmologies, okay, is the creation story. We have an evolutionary cosmological creation story. Big Bang. These things happen, blah, 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 blah. Life appears at this point, blah, 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 blah. From life, we get complex life forms, and then we get primates, and then we get collective learning or symbolic language. This is the creation story that is the dominant story for, I guess you would have to say, a materialist Western world. But there's also a kind of sense of the human spirit at work. And Christian presents us with a problem. He says this has decentered us. Decentered, that's in this highlight there. Had decentered the earth and the human beings within the cosmological order. And one of the things he seeks to do with his creation story, his big history story, is to reinsert us, to put us back into the creation story at the very center again. And he does that through the idea of complexity. So let's scroll down and see where we get. A little bit further down. All right, so first thing he presents us with is temporal and spatial scales. He says, my God, lots of time, 13 odd billion years, right? We've been doing things in this cosmos, not we as human beings, of course, but as matter. There's been experiment after experiment in forms of complexity of arranging matter. And I'll tell you what, the cosmos is pretty big. Okay, if you've ever read or watched The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, you know the galaxy is big. Not just the galaxy, that's just one amongst billions of galaxies and so forth. So spatial scales are also enormous, and Christian spends some time playing with those, but he does it almost in a sense just to set the scene, because they don't interest him so much. Okay, what interests him is this, the maps of complexity. Okay. So, and I've written in maps here, that's my own little bit there. See, one of the more interesting is this map of complexity. For David Christian, complexity is how we manage our energy, basically, and the structures that are created across the evolutionary story that sees shifts in energy, what you would call an energy regime. He doesn't use that term here, but there are plenty of readings in the world history library, you could say, that talk about energy regimes. Christian was writing this 17 years ago, and his thought and world historians' thoughts and big historians' thoughts have progressed considerably since this point. But it's still an excellent place to start. So he talks about Eric Chasson's definition of complexity is a state of intricacy and complication and variety. Points out that we keep on going, that, basically because of the laws of thermodynamics, especially the law of the second law, which is entropy or entropic, that every energy loses and dissipates, and that means that complexity dissipates. Okay, we have energy as in the energy differential. The more energy we have, says David Christian, as a surplus, the more we are able to do or achieve things in the world. Okay, and it's the potential difference between the amount of energy we create to maintain an existence, a certain level of order, and that what's left above that, which is the level for creativity and innovation, which, as we've managed to push that level above what we need just for maintenance needs, we get more complex societies. Okay, and that's led to the modern world, as we would call it, the modern world being only the world that we inhabit now. A lot of stuff there that you can just skim over. Some students seem to think you have to get to know Ludwig Boltzmann very well. No, you don't. Boltzmann is brought in as, a bit player in a story. Okay, and so is Kaufman for that matter. But what is important in David Christian's estimation, and in the way he approaches world history and now big history, because big history grew out of this, is this idea of order. And that the fact is that order is rare. Not only is it rare, but because of the second law of thermodynamics, because of entropy, where energy is always leaking out of systems, we're always having to put more energy into the system to maintain even just where we are. So as we've created complex systems in our modern world, we're having to find more and more energy, okay, which has led to the growth model. And it's also led to the absolute dismay of people when we start to understand that there are limits to growth, at least limits to material fossil fuel based growth, okay? Says Christian. Okay, so we've got this interesting tensional problem here, that order is rare. This helps us feel special. Oh, human beings have done so much with the resources that we have at our fingertips, but at the same time we're deeply vulnerable. History is rethinking this, because history has often been about invulnerability of human beings over periods of time. I mean, history is focused on the ghoulish, horrible amounts of deaths caused by Genghis Khan or plagues or whatever. But ultimately, history has tended to be triumphant in the sense that human beings, over all our suffering and struggles, have got to where we are today. And Christian's part of that triumphant sort of process, but he's also a prophet, saying, okay, we've got this far because of our relationship with energy, because of our relationship with managing complexity, but we're heading towards an energy and complexity crisis. So what do we have here? Maintenance of energy requires that we do work. We have to keep working, we have to keep mining, we have to keep burning, we have to keep chopping, we have to keep doing all those things that we actually know we shouldn't be doing, as we struggle to find and rethink the logic of culture and civilization if it is going to move into another relationship with energy. That's the background story here. So there is a threshold to complexity, and this concept of threshold comes in again and again in world history and big history particularly. And we touch upon it again and again in the course. Of course, energy, complexity and collective learning, along with thresholds, for instance, these are all things that are going to be in your exam. You need to be already thinking, okay, week 1, week 13, end of story, week 14 or 15, whenever the exams are scheduled, that's when you have to sort of go, okay, these are the things that I've learnt from this course. David Christian's reading is a very key reading in helping you prepare for that moment. He goes back to Eric Chaisson, argues that the more complex an object is, the denser the energy flows. And we need more and more energy to supply the needs for our modern world, for instance. Okay, and then Christian has the cheek to suggest that we can actually rank and order the world around complexities and levels of complexity and levels of energy flow. So he gives us a map, he gives us a chart, doesn't he? In the next page, we'll get there. There it is. The galaxy, the energy, the free energy flow is 1. The star is 2. Planets are 75. Come right down to society here at 500,000. Okay, ergs. Okay, so, and I don't expect you to worry about those figures. I don't worry about the figures, except you can say, well, 1, it's nowhere near as big as 150,000. And that's nowhere near as big as 500,000. So basically, it's a model of relationship that demonstrates the hierarchies that we can think about in terms of understanding where human civilization sits and why it is so vulnerable. Okay, so as Martin Rees points out, quoted here, a star is simpler than an insect. Stars are bigger than insects, but a star is just hydrogen being turned into helium, right? Just burning away. Okay, until it's all burnt and the star dies. And then the system that the star supports dies. Long before actually the star fully dies, you know. So that's another story. But insects, you squash an insect, you starve an insect, or the insect just lives its happy life. A butterfly flying around lives it for how long do butterflies live for? Someone told me it was a couple of weeks. But I don't know. It's kind of, from the human perspective, it's transitory. It's like that. Cup of tea time. So let's move down. So part of this relationship of complexity is also to do with what can we do with the excess energy we have. And this is where Christian starts talking about the universe's creativity. We've seen that if we just look at the evolution, particularly from in the biological era, of simple single-celled organisms through to complex-celled organisms through to organisms of highly developed social patterns like ants and bees and monkeys and chimps and whatever else. Okay, so there is this creativity built into life. Why? Because it is unstable. There's no creativity really in a star. A star does one thing. It chews up hydrogen and spits out helium. Okay? But here we have creativity at play. And that's really important because ultimately, David Christian puts a lot of hope in creativity because he links creativity in our cultural sense, not the natural sense, to our ability to adapt via collective learning. So here we have, straight underneath creativity, he talks about adaptation enables living organisms to find more and more ways of extracting energy flows. Okay, so he's still in the biological here. He's still talking organisms solving problems in relation to access to energy, and they evolve in different ways. So what we have is a kind of model that's set up here for, here we come, humans enter the story. So what is the logic here? Well, so far David Christian has talked about energy and he's talked about complexity. And he's said, all right, so we can see that scales of time and scales of space don't really tell us much about human beings other than the fact that we are on a speck of dust in a vast cosmos, okay? basically mean nothing in terms of the cosmos. But then he says, for us human beings, we seem to be rather self-obsessed. We think we are important and we want to know why. He says, well, if we start thinking about human beings in relation to complexity and our relationship to energy and our ability to evolve beyond the natural, that is significant. And he says it's rare. All right, so let's have a look at this. So the logic then of Christian's argument is that we have natural selection. All right, that means whoever can access energy will thrive. Whoever can change their energy access relationships or processes over time will adapt and continue to thrive, whereas other creatures will die out and become extinct. We've seen that over over millions of years. Okay. He says also that organisms, especially higher level organisms, have the capacity to learn. Even single-celled organisms have learnt to go towards or away from light, for instance, and they've learnt to sense different forms of chemical to know whether they are friendly or a foe, enemies. So this kind of learning has been encoded into DNA, but when we get to more complex forms of life, the learning that a sea otter or a penguin or a chimp or any form of primate would do tends to be stuck only within the experience of the individual. So that's learning. Keep following down the logic. Okay, and there's a lot of narrative there. And like all historians, David Christian loves a good story. So he talks about chimpanzees, and I can tell you the number of students who spend half their first assessment item talking about chimpanzees in symbolic language and missing the point entirely. I'd be a rich person if I was given $1 for every one of those. Please don't do that. Just see the story for what it is, a demonstration of the logic that Christian is weaving. Along comes symbolic language. Okay, so this is where Shakespeare or, in the beginning was the Word and the Word was made flesh from the Bible, or Om Mani Padme Hum from, Buddhism, whatever it is, this language comes in it does something totally different. It captures meaning and it is passable on. You can pass that on. Not only can I write a book or an article like this and pass it on to you, but we can pass on language chunks of meaning. Okay, so oral traditions, of course, were the main form of transmitting knowledge for 100 to 1,000 years at least, whenever symbolic language first appears. But he says that symbolic language allows us to develop a third adaptive mechanism. And this is the clincher for world historians, or big historians as David Christian is now. It's collective learning. So now we have the collective capacity of humans no longer function as individuals, as I say down here. Okay, it is a collective process. Okay, and that collective process gives us huge power, the power of culture. Okay, the results are transformative. Everything changes with collective learning. Things speed up. Okay, our species can adapt at a much more rapid pace. Cultural adaptation is cumulative. It builds on the past and we take it into the future. Okay. This is another reason why history is important, because history is cultural memory. Okay. As a result of this new non-genetic mechanism of adaptation, humans have acquired over time an astonishing ecological power. That's clincher as well, and many world historians, particularly, and big historians too, but world historians even more so, and there is a difference. The difference is in focus or emphasis. Spend a lot of time looking at our relationship to the environment, in other words, our ecological power and the energy regimes that underpin them. So, almost in a sense, summing up part of his key argument here, Christian says it is collective learning that distinguishes human history from natural history. We have culture and we have nature. They are not separate, they overlap one another like that. But culture is something that human beings do in relation to nature. And we draw our cultural resources based on the natural world we inhabit. this is part of the reason why different forms of cultures have emerged around the planet, because nature doesn't stay the same. There is a wide variety of natural environments, and human beings have shown incredible flexibility in adapting to them all, from the snowy tundra through to the equatorial rainforests, and we've fitted in everywhere. So the logic for Christian then takes us to this point, and he says, now what's going on? The acceleration of human ecological power, made possible basically the world we're in. A lot of blah blah blah, and of course it's all useful to read. I highlighted the word sahul because he's talking about the movement of human beings across the planet. When we run out of ecological resources, we move on. And the logic in the early period that Christian's talking about here, for instance, is that tribal/family units would break up, and one family unit would stay in place and the other one would move on. And it was that drove the movement of human beings across the planet. And it's called extensification. That means we need to split up here. We've reached 50 people in the family. We're going to have to break it, because generally it's about 30 people in a family unit that can manage a certain footprint, ecological footprint. Okay, so what happens? In a mere 10,000 years, human beings began to exploit their environments intensively. So that's where I put this little one, intensification, extensification. Intensive exploitation is where, instead of just hunter-gathering, we start manipulating the environment, planting seeds, domesticating animals, and so on. We manipulate our surroundings, New niches, we create new niches or spaces. In other words, new environments, new micro contexts in which we can manage some process that was previously natural and wild, and we domesticate it. So we domesticate seeds, we domesticate plants, we domesticate animals, and so on. And ultimately, of course, all of this sitting behind that is that we change our own habits as a species. We domesticate ourselves. We are no longer hunter-gathering. We are sedentary farmers, agriculturalists. And this 10,000 years that he's talking about in this space begins the province of what we might call traditional history, especially once we start writing down our symbolic language. All right? So the following logic, we've got to follow Christian's logic. If we don't follow the logic, you're going to be mystified. And you've got to understand that there is a single story through here, which we'll come back to at the end here, because we're getting close now. So more independent So this is where, go back here, as humans settled in denser communities, they became more interdependent, not independent, I misread that, and their social networks became more complex, So this is the city environment, village to city to state to empire, essentially, So this links, there's the management of these larger social units links energy with complexity, and how we manage things when we get to a point where complexity is energy hungry. Well, the early method was pretty much what the hunter-gatherers would do. We'd go somewhere else and we'd take somebody else's resources, essentially. So that's this period of state and empire colonization. Going out and taking resources from some other place. But also, we kept improving agricultural methods. So we invented irrigation, we invented canals, we invented windmills, and so on. Here's this stuff showing all this energy consumption. So how we've managed to leverage energy using various forms. So the Paleolithic was minimal, early agriculture, advanced agriculture, industrial, and then technological. And we can see how energy demands have increased over time. I'm just going to keep spinning over this, because this is all the Christians using data. We can't tell a story in history without evidence, without data. And so Christians doing just that with all of this stuff here. I'm just going to skim right over it all as we get towards the next part. So what's the moral of the story, says David Christian? I think you probably already know if you've followed my argument. Human history marks something new. That's part of the moral, And there's, we are like campers around a fire. The sun is the fireplace. Our planet is just in the right spot, so, and going around and around that sun. Okay, it's what they later called the Goldilocks principle, or the Goldilocks position. It's just not too hot and it's not too cold. It's just right. If you know your Goldilocks story, if you don't, go and look it up, and just wonder about what kind of childhood you've had if you don't know about Goldilocks. But the point is that there are these Goldilocks conditions in which the kind of life, biological life that we understand, and it's not to say there aren't other life forms possibly that we have no idea about, but looking for the kind of life conditions that we experience here on our planet has become, one of the drives of astronomers who are looking for exoplanets that are now sitting in just the same sort of context as our own planet in relation to its sun. So here we are. And this is remarkable. So part of the story, the moral of the story again, is that we're still bleeding special. Okay? So we've overcome many ecological constraints. Oh, we're just so wonderful. We've overcome all these constraints. And it's true, we have, and it's quite extraordinary. So what's the price of success? Increasing human control over the energy and resources of the biosphere has measurable consequences for the entire biosphere. If one organism hogs too much energy, or so much, okay, it's going to have adverse effects on others who have with less energy available to them. Okay, it's no surprise that humans have flourished and other species have withered. And there again, a bit of evidence. If you want some evidence, some data, Christian will give it to you, because he spent 20 years before he wrote this in preparing courses just like the one that you're taking now. So we're initiating, our success has initiated another major extinction event. All right, I don't think unless you are very good at being related to an ostrich and sticking your head in the sand, I don't think you can argue against that. There are many nuanced arguments around it, and I'm not denying that, and we need to think very carefully about what's happening in the world. But certainly anthropogenic change, which means change initiated by human activity, has majorly impacted on the planet and on human beings, as well as other non-human or the more human species as well. So the moral is now two-edged. We are exceptional. Okay. Keep going down. So nearly there. I want to speed this up a bit. Here we go. There's a lot of blah again. Okay. He points out that we nearly went extinct because brain. So he's come back and he's reiterating parts of the earlier argument, because he wants to come and end up with this idea of evolution here. Okay. So oops, stop that. And down to the next section. Okay, so here it is. By this logic, there ought to be millions of planets in our galaxy inhabited by intelligent beings. He's applying logic, okay? Yet we have not a shred of evidence for any of this, he says. Okay, but what do we know? What can we say? Ultimately, as world historians, there's one conclusion, that these arguments may or may not work. All they are intended to do is suggest that the modern creation story, the evolutionary creation story, does not necessarily deprive human history of meaning or significance. Whether we can be happy, proud of what we've done as human beings, or whether we need to stand in terror at our own success, or whether we sit somewhere in between and think about the paradoxes of being human and of the whole process of conscious evolution, because once we got symbolic language and we started being able to use collective learning, we did become conscious players in our evolution. Though culture still is very much about conditioning and, the conditioned assumptions that the only way forward, says our government, still living, 19th and 20th century logic, is to keep mining, is to keep chopping trees down, is to keep exploiting the energy resources that we have available. Why? Because the economy needs it. But there are other economies. There are other energy flows. There are other stories that are perhaps more enabling of open human futures. And that's the kind of moral story that David Christian really wants to pass on to us. That we are, with collective learning, we are co-creators. of the world we inhabit. On the modern map of complexity, humans are central, okay? As we always have been in more traditional cosmologies. That's part of his, moral thinking, okay? Is that, and history has always been somehow moral. It's always been about saying, these are the heroes, these are the bad guys, these are the problems, this is how we overcame the problems, and so on. So history is still fulfilling much of that. But the thing about big history in the hands of David Christian, but also in the way we approach it in this course, which is a fusion between big history and world history, is to say, all right, human beings, and I can jump out of this now, can't I? Human beings have achieved a huge amount. We've achieved it by managing to access more and more energy over time. We know that energy has always been key to changing of the environment, whether it's pre-human, even pre-life, or because we understand that energy gets to points of complexity or collapse. And if new forms of complexity can be maintained, we have a shift. So, and here David Christian is following the logic of Eric Chasson, who says, the Big Bang, there was, just light, particulate, and then we ended up with stars being born, and then galaxies being born. And from that, each one of those was a new form of complexity. And as things cooled down, we ended up with, the periodic table. And then as things continued to cool down and the sun and, stars were forming, planets formed around those. And some of those planets, like ours, happen to be just in the right spot, that Goldilocks position, for life to emerge. And life emerged very, very quickly on this planet. It was only, it wasn't a billion years after the planet formed. It was less than, 50 million or 100 million or something. It was very, very soon. And then life spent all this slow time, but slowly but surely it's increased. And it's increased because life forms access more diverse forms of energy. They affected the environment in which they live in ways like by producing oxygen, photosynthesis and so on, then growing spines and moving out of the water and so on onto land, and colonizing new places, adapting to new situations, accessing new forms of energy, and going through the rise and fall of that creativity that is part of evolution, in the Darwinian sense of evolution. Ultimately, we end up with us here. So for me, this article maps out the logic of this course. World history is about thinking about our collective learning and how we've done it at different times in different places. It's about thinking about how we've learned to manage energy in different and creative ways, and how we've managed to adjust our social world and our cultural world to the increased complexity that an energy surplus gives us or provides us. This is all at the heart of the logic of this piece, and this piece supplies the logic for this course, and that's why I place so much emphasis on it. That's why the first assessment item is based on it, and why we keep returning to the logic of this essay across the entirety of the course. All 13 weeks, we don't ever really escape from energy, complexity, and collective learning. I hope this has been a help to you. I hope it also helps you think about, well, how are you going to navigate all the other art readings in this course? The way I do it, I do it this way with all my own work. When I'm doing my own research, I highlight things or I bold things depending on which, modality I'm using, and sometimes I will cut those bits out as well and pop them onto a document so that I've got them at my fingertips for when I need to write an essay. So I hope it's been helpful to you, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all this week, and of course Gil and Rosie, I'm speaking with them as well. Take good care and go back and read that reading again. I'm hoping that you come really well prepared this week. Look forward to seeing you all. Bye bye.